Hello. So, I figured that today we would do some proper ASMR. If you've listened to my channel before, firstly, you will find there is not much here, but that might change. And part of that change is me trying to find out where I can offer something that's kind of interesting and relaxing and, um, I hate to use the phrase true to me, but I would like to do something that I think is kind of relevant to me. And one of those things is TV and kind of media in general, really. So I figured that I would do a quick kind of piece on what I think will happen in the season finale of Succession. And really, it's a series finale as well. It's the end of the show. It's been going on for, I guess, 4 years now. They've had 4 seasons. They've said that it's coming towards an end. And we're now at a point where stories are starting to come to a close and threads are begin being tied up. And there are lingering questions of what's going to happen and what's going to happen to who, and so on and so forth. Now, the obvious thing here is that if you haven't seen Succession and you plan to, don't listen to this because you're going to basically spoil it for yourself with what I'm talking about. I won't be too spoilery, but you can kind of infer from just listening in as to whether or not something has happened that you're not supposed to know about yet, and so on and so forth. In addition, if you've never seen Succession and you don't plan to watch it, this also might not be for you, and I apologize in advance. But let's begin. Now, this is where I awkwardly can't actually spell Succession. So, the key thing about the show is that it's to do with I guess you would call them a dynasty family that runs a media conglomerate called Waystar Royco. And the entire premise of the show is really a kind of Shakespearean depiction of how this family, in its kind of current form, has different members that are vying for control of the company as CEO. And there are various roles. I'm not going to list the roles available to the family in the company, but it's a typical corporate structure for a business. There's a CEO, CFO, so on and so forth. And the show really is just about the machinations of this family and its particular members fighting to try and kind of claim their seat at the table, or at least rather ideally for them, the top spot as CEO, president, so on and so forth. As the name of the show suggests, really this all starts in season 1 when Logan Roy, who is the patriarch of the family and the leader of the company, has a stroke and is kind of thought to be on his way out. And that starts off the chain of events that leads to his 4 children, which is an ironic kind of joke because he has a 4th child, Connor, that who's led his entire life not really being part of the family. But his 3 kind of primary children, for lack of better wording, Shiv, Kendall, and Roman, spend the series vying for control and kind of forming alliances, betraying each other, betraying their friends, family, so on and so forth, in a bid to, in effect, control the company. This takes place over, I guess, 4 years in the show. Actually, as I'm saying that, I kind of wonder if that isn't the case. I kind of wonder if actually it's quicker than that. And maybe I'll have to go and do some research afterwards. The reason I wonder if it's not as quick as that is because, as an example, season 4 seems to be over the space of about a week and a half, 2 weeks. So it may not be anywhere near that kind of length. But in reality, the show started in 2019, we're now in 2023, and it's coming to an end. So we'll call it 4 years, but it probably isn't 4 years in the show. Now, the key thing here, really, is nobody quite knows how this is going to end, because even though you can make a good kind of guess, the show has a history of doing quite surprising twists and turns. Massive spoiler, so don't listen beyond this if you haven't seen the show and you plan to watch it, or if you haven't seen the majority of season 4. The big twist and revelation of season 4 is that Logan Roy dies. And so, whereas the last 2 to 3 seasons have spent Kendall primarily being the one that's going to be vying for the top position, Logan has prevented that because he's still alive, he's still cracking, he's not going to let Kendall usurp him and take control of the company. That changes when Logan dies in the start of season 4, and they've spent the last season arguing amongst themselves about who should be controlling the company. That has fallen, at the moment, to Kendall and Roman as joint CEOs, which I believe is quite an uncommon thing. The only company I can think of that had joint CEOs is Salesforce, and that collapsed recently, I believe. I think one of the co-CEOs recently resigned. So that's kind of where the series is at the moment, is they're in charge of the company. They're basically trying to prevent the takeover of the company by another group, a Swedish group, who are much like kind of like a Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok kind of style technology company. And what they're attempting to do is buy out the company and primarily its assets and its technology. And Kendall and Roman don't want this to happen. As to why, it's really anybody's kind of guess, really. There's obviously on-screen kind of realistic elements to it where, it's their father's company and, they've always been kind of heirs to the throne. They don't want to lose that. But there's also the kind of unspoken reality that you don't see on screen. That there's a lot of politics at play and economics, and they don't think it's necessarily the best decision for them. So, as to whether or not that actually happens is a good question. So, I'm going to suggest that there are probably, I don't know, let's call it maybe 5 or 6 different outcomes in this. I think, in fact, let's pick this apart bit by bit. Okay, so, is someone going to die? Now, the reason I say that is, first and foremost, I think of this as a bit of a Shakespearean tragedy. And if you have read any Shakespeare or seen any Shakespeare in a play form, or even in movie form for that matter, the vast majority of the plays are tragedies. There are classical tragedies. They're not always kind of like, everybody dies. But generally speaking, there tends to be something tragic that happens, hence tragedy. And there are definitely different Shakespearean kind of plays at work in here. There's a really good explanation of how Succession is like King Lear. And I'll put a link to that video in the comments below, because the person that goes into that does a very good job of explaining it, and much better than I would do. So I recommend you take a look at that. I think, for me, I always think of Hamlet when I see Succession, and primarily I think of Hamlet from the depiction of Kendall. And the reason I say that is that Hamlet is this very tragic, kind of usurped kind of figure who, is very kind of like down on his luck and thinks very highly of himself, but the world doesn't. And Kendall really is that kind of character. And I can see a reality where Kendall meets a kind of sticky end. There's been quite a lot of foreshadowing of that throughout the show, where Kendall has come close to death quite a few times, and if I think about it correctly, it's happened at least once in every season. So in season 1, I believe he almost drowned driving a car with a English boy when the guy driving the car crashed into a river, and Kendall nearly drowned then. In the second season, Kendall nearly drowned when he was... Oh, did he? Maybe he didn't. I'm confusing, I think, two different things here. Because there was a scene, I believe, actually maybe in the third season, when Kendall was rescued from his pool, because I think he got drunk in the pool and was basically rescued by an attendant or, a servant, somebody along those lines. And, there was a concern in the third season that he was suicidal or something along those lines. And, maybe perhaps based upon that logic, Kendall's going to meet a sticky end in the fourth season. And, like I said, there's a lot of stuff in Succession that you kind of think, oh, maybe that will happen, and it never does. And that's what the show really is very good at, is kind of making you think about how something might happen, but it never actually does come to fruition. It's just something that kind of sticks in your mind and you kind of fantasize a bit about it. So I think there's a possibility that Kendall dies, and we'll write that down. Okay, so there's a possibility that someone dies, and excuse my handwriting. Could it be Roman? Roman, in the last episode, as we saw, had a very difficult time at his father's funeral, struggled to get his words out, and was unable to say anything, really. He was very, negatively impacted by it, and was unable to finish his sentence, and his sister and his brother had to come and kind of rescue him and, put an arm around him and say, it's okay, we'll continue for you. And I think part of that self-loathing that Roman has, that's very well documented throughout the show, really came to fruition in that episode, where Roman likes to kind of talk the talk, but he's very unable to walk the walk. And I think we can all be a bit like that. I think that Roman is almost like a living bravado and ego. He wears his ego very externally, but internally he's very insecure and very self-loathing. And at the end of the last episode, we see him running in towards the group of protesters that are protesting the new president, Mencken, and quite clearly trying to cause harm to himself. He's looking for somebody to cause him physical pain. And they do. They punch him, they kick him. And that's the last we saw of Roman, really, was that he looks like he'd been punched in the eye. And, he achieved his goal of wanting to be hurt and punished for his failure. Do I think Roman's likely to meet a unsavory end? I don't think so. I think that Roman is a bit of a tragic character in a more sympathetic way than Kendall is. I think Kendall, even though you feel sorry for him, he doesn't do himself any favors. Whereas Roman does at times kind of seem to have like a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that it would be quite a sad end if Roman were to kind of, be offed before he's had a chance to kind of redeem himself in a way, or to kind of see that there is another way forwards. He's always been the character in the show that's bullied and has been kind of mistreated, really, I think is the best way of kind of wording it. And what I mean by that is that, there's the story that you talk about in the second season, or maybe it's the first season, where, the kids used to lock him up in a dog cage and, force him to eat dog food in order to be allowed out. And, he's the younger, physically smaller sibling, the runt of the litter, I guess you would call him. And I think that it would be kind of a cruel end to a TV show to have him be the one that, meets that kind of unhappy ending. I think the likelihood of Connor or Shiv meeting an unhappy ending is nil. I can't see it happening with Connor, because even though he's a member of the family, he's not a significant character in the same way that the the trio are. I just can't see them killing Shiv either, because it would feel inappropriate, I think, to kill Shiv off, because if we look at it from a real world perspective, we're talking about a female character trying to obtain a position of power, and I think for the writers to kill her off and have a male assume that role would be a bit kind of like, why did you do that? So I think that's quite unlikely. So I think the likelihood of somebody dying is quite low. Now, an article I read about this, which kind of inspired a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about here and made me had a good kind of think about things. Somebody said, well, what happens if nothing happens? And I actually think that is possibly the most likely. The article said, hey, this is very minimal. Like, it's a TV show. There's no reality where the show ends with nothing happening. But I actually think that that's quite possible. And I'll tell you why as soon as I learn how to write. I'm writing this at an angle, so I apologize that it's a bit tricky. So, the reason that I think that nothing happens and that we're left in this kind of status quo is that the show is fundamentally a critique of modern day capitalism, where these ultra rich people with no real kind of stake in society are free to shape kind of national and international events. That was something that was very obvious in the last episode. Actually, the episode before that, the one prior to the funeral, where they were basically in charge of calling the election. And the reason that happened was because they had, they didn't have the evidence for, but they felt that they had enough reasoning to call Wisconsin for Jared Mencken, who is seen as a fascist, far-right politician who was at the time a nominee for president and is now in the show president. Or at least, I guess, president-elect, because I believe it's only been a day since he won. And that really was an evidence kind of point of them shaping world events based upon their own personal kind of biases. And the reason that happened was because Shiv, in effect, betrayed Roman and Kendall. And for Kendall, that was kind of the last straw. As the decider amongst the three of them about whether or not to call Wisconsin prematurely, before other TV networks did, Kendall decided after the revelation that Shiv has been secretly working with Mattsson, the Swedish CEO, to buy Waystar Royco, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And that was, a little bit too far gone. And so he decided to side with Roman, and he said, hey, let's call Wisconsin. They called Wisconsin, and that was enough to have Jared Mencken declared the winner of the presidential election. And coming back to why I think this plays into the idea that nothing happens, I think that fundamentally the show really is about nothing, which sounds a bit strange for such a popular show. And the reason I say that is because really there hasn't been anything that's happened. The show fundamentally is about the people themselves. It's not about really their lives amongst the kind of broader country and society. It really is just the kind of machinations of this small kind of group of people who happen to be very powerful and influential and rich. And I think there's a very good likelihood that the show ends with basically just the way it started, which is continual kind of battles between this family for positions of power. And I think that is a reflection of modern day kind of capitalism, where, you have so much money, so much wealth, and so much power to influence change, but fundamentally nothing really does change, because they're like these large kind of iceberg organizations that are really difficult to kind of like push in a new direction. And the real world reality is that they only have an hour to an hour and a half to wrap up this show, and I can't see them doing anything that's significant in that time, unless there's a time jump, which there very well could be. But I think there's a good possibility that the show ends with nothing really happening, because if at its core it's been a critique of people being selfish, inconsiderate, difficult, arrogant, really all the worst traits of humanity. The most fitting end, I think, would be that nothing really happens, and that's just it. Which is a funny way to end it, because I appreciate that people would want to, have an ending where they're like, oh, that was really satisfying. I feel like we got a conclusion here. But I can see a very strong possibility that it ends with people realizing that this show has all been about how, you get all these kind of power struggles and these backdoor deals and these usurping of control of various bits and pieces, but nothing really changes. So that's a possibility, I think. Now let's have a little think about what else might happen. I also think that there's a reality where it's none of the family in control. There are many other players involved in the show. So beyond the family, who is, again, Kendall, Logan, Shiv, Connor, and Roman, you have, for instance, Greg, who is cousin Greg. You have Tom Wamsgans, who is Shiv's kind of, well, they are married, but they seem to be in a bit of a lull in their relationship. And I think that there's a good possibility that one of the broader family, and beyond that, ends up in control of the company. As to how that would happen, who knows? If the Waystar Royco deal with Matsson's company goes through, presumably it's down to Matsson to put a Roy family member in control as CEO of what remains of the business, and there's a good chance that he might not do that. If Shiv decides that it's gone too far and she turns her back on Matsson and says, no thanks, I'm not doing this anymore, he could likewise turn around and say, well, sorry, you're not going to be the CEO. And he's very unlikely to put Kendall or Roman, and definitely not Connor, in that position. And those are the only surviving family members, apart from Greg. Now, Greg's not really a Roy. Greg is a Hirsch, which is the other side of the family. We don't know many other Hirsches. I believe, I suppose, Logan's brother, who I am now forgetting the name of, his daughter is Greg's mum, and she is a Hirsch. So I guess my understanding might be that the Hirsches aren't actually, I guess maybe she married and got that name. So it might be that that's how that works. Now Greg is a bit of a black sheep of the show, because ever since the very beginning, actually I believe Greg shows up. He's the first person I think that is shown in the show. I think the very first scene is him at the theme park, where he basically smokes too much weed and he's wearing a like a mascot kind of costume in the theme park, and he gets overwhelmed and he's sick and vomits all over a child and is promptly fired. At which point his mother sends him to go and see his uncle Logan, and basically says, please, for the love of God, give me a job and ideally some money. And Greg has spent the last, I guess, 4 seasons trying to put his kind of foot in every door that would open for him. And it's worked so far. He teamed up with Tom, who eventually became the chief of the ATN news division in Waystar. And he, thus far, has done quite well for himself. He's on okay terms with most of the primary family. I don't think any of them would, in fact, there's no think about it, none of them would, go out on a limb to help him, but they'll happily kind of confide in him if they need to. The last time we really saw Greg kind of properly engaged was in the election episode, where he learned some misdealings that Shiv had been involved in, and appeared to tell them to Kendall quite quickly after Shiv threatened him to not do so. So that didn't end well for Greg. We then see him next in the funeral episode, the one just gone, where he is basically entrusted to ensure that the grandfather, Ewan, I remember his name now, doesn't get up on the stage at Logan's funeral and give some sort of speech. Naturally, that doesn't happen. Ewan does get up on the stage. He says that he loves his brother, but fundamentally he's an evil human being. And the kids, Kendall, Shiv, Roman, don't like that, understandably. So they're not in the good books with Greg at the moment. Well, vice versa. Greg's not in their good books. But there's been a prevailing kind of theme that Greg seems to make friends in high places. There was a mocking of that in the last episode at the wake of the funeral, where Greg went up to the now president-elect Mencken and wanted to introduce himself and kind of just be there as a, here's my face, this is what I do, let me know if you need anything. And Mencken, understandably, hurried him away very quickly, and Shiv came to rescue the president-elect and pulled him away. And that was the last time we saw Greg. But it's in keeping with this theme that Greg seems to find himself in high places with high people, both people that smoke weed and literally high, powerful, influential people. And I think there is a possibility that Greg ends up in control of the company. And the reason I say that is at the start of the season, the team led an entourage to Sweden to meet Madsen and his team and basically try and work out what's going on with this deal. And Greg very quickly took it upon himself to get in with the Madsen team and introduce himself. And naturally, they all think he's a bit of a clown. They think he's kind of an idiot. They think he's probably, a useful idiot, but fundamentally still an idiot. And even though that's their verdict, there's still a reality where Madsen seems to have this odd kind of affection for Greg. And it might again just be the fact that he thinks this guy's a useful idiot, he knows things, let's keep him close. But I also think there's a reality where Madsen is not a serious person. He's very much supposed to be an archetype of this kind of Silicon Valley tech bro who is just in it because firstly he wants money, but secondly he enjoys just upsetting things. And he's there to basically try and upset the industry that he's vying to control. And I can think of no bigger upset to that industry and to the system, so to speak, than putting Greg in control of the company. And that could very well happen if there's a reality where Madsen does purchase the company, which could be the outcome of the show, that he says, well, okay, this is my person that's going in charge, it's Greg. Whether or not Greg can do the job is another question. And what I mean by that is part of this having Greg surround himself with powerful people is that he seems to have developed a bit of an entourage of people that can kind of help him. And he's definitely developed more of a nastiness as the show has gone on. He started off very kind of weak and kind of feeble and, very reliant upon other people to get anything done. And as we see in the election episode, that's now developed into this kind of, I'm Greg Hirsch, I'm part of the Roy family, and if you don't do this, you're going to suffer. And I think that he's starting to develop the chops, the cruelty of somebody of that kind of position. So I think that's a possibility. Now, if you aren't familiar with the writer of the show, the creator, Jesse Armstrong, he did a show a few years ago on British TV called Peep Show. And Peep Show is basically a show about nothing as well. It's just about two men, Jeremy and Mark, who live in a London apartment, and basically it's a depiction of their lives and how their lives suck, and they continue to suck, and they suck for the entire 9 seasons of the show. And in some ways, I kind of wonder if, in the way that Succession is a show about richness and power and how you can never lose that, Peep Show is like the antithesis of that, where it's about you can try as hard as you want, you'll never climb out of the ditch. And Succession seems to be kind of the mirror image of that, where it's like this idea that you can be Kendall and you can cover up the manslaughter of somebody that's driven your car and you knowingly force them basically to drive when they were under influence of drugs. Or you can be, Roman, who's teamed up with a far-right fascist to basically get a one-over on his siblings. And the various other scandals, whether it be the cruise scandal where they covered up, monstrous sexual assault allegations, and so on and so forth. And nothing really comes to bite them. It's the opposite of Peep Show, because Peep Show is very kind of like a idea that these two people were born into the, part of the system that they're born into, and they can never do anything to actually break out of that. There will always just be Mark and Jeremy from London. Whereas Kendall, Roman, Shiv could quite literally kill somebody and never see the repercussions of that. And I think that's kind of a commentary as well on somebody like Donald Trump, who, infamously said that he could shoot somebody dead on Fifth Avenue and still be elected. And it's no secret that Succession is a critique of that kind of absolute power, and how you can really be the worst of the worst and still come out on top. And that's the funny thing about the show, is it pulls you in and makes you really kind of think, hey, if this goes the way that I think it's going to go, they're going to lose everything. But that won't happen. Come back to this episode of my channel in a week and let me know if it does happen, because I'm pretty adamant that this is going to be a bit of a nothing burger. I think there'll be something that significant happens, but I don't think that the fundamentals of the company or the family are going to change, because that's not what the show is about. The show is about these individuals and how they are narcissistic, they're selfish, they're cruel, they're unkind, and fundamentally though, the commentary about the show is that these people are real people. They might not be called Kendall, Shiv, and Roman in real life, but these types of people exist, and they do exactly the same sort of things that these characters do in real life, and they never meet justice. And that's why I think that fundamentally nothing's going to happen.